The first thing he noticed was the smell, a sour, heavy smell of rotting spices and wet straw. Then pain in his neck, dull and suffocating, as if someone had been holding him by the throat all night. He opened his eyes and saw a dark wooden ceiling with cracks and cobwebs in the corners. It wasn't his ceiling. This wasn't his room. He tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't obey at first. His hands felt foreign, thin and calloused with dirt under the nails. He brought them up to his face and froze. These weren't his hands. He sat up with a jolt, and his head spun so much that he had to brace his palms against the floor. The floor was earthen, cold and damp. All around lay sacks filled with something loose, bundles of sticks tied with twine, clay pots with chipped rims. He was in the back room of some kind of shop, a small, run-down shop that smelled as if hope had died there. He looked down. There was a red mark on his neck, wide and distinct, a mark left by a rope. A hook driven into a ceiling beam jutted out above his head. A severed rope lay on the floor nearby. Someone had taken him down from the noose. Someone had pulled him back from death. Or perhaps someone had pulled back from death the person who had been here before him, because Lee Min-jae remembered clearly that he had died. Not here. Not like this. He had died at an empty interchange in Seoul at 3 in the morning when he fell asleep at the wheel on his way back from a nighttime inventory check. The last things he saw were headlights and a concrete pillar, and now he was sitting on the dirt floor inside a dead man's body, trying to remember how to breathe. Panic washed over him in a wave, hot and nauseating. He dug his fingers into the straw and forced himself to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He counted to 20, then to 30. Then he opened his eyes again and began to look around. Not like a man who was afraid, but like a man assessing the situation. 3 sacks against the wall. He pulled at the edge of the nearest one and poured a handful into his palm. Pepper, whole black peppercorns. The bottom of the sack was dark with moisture, dampness. That means a 30% loss on the market price if sold as is. But if he transfers it to a dry container and sifts it, he can reduce the loss to 10%. The second sack. Cinnamon, sticks tied into bundles, an old batch, and aroma is faint. It's too late to sell them as whole sticks, but if ground up and packaged in small portions, it'll work as a homemade spice blend. Third bag. Salt, coarse and gray. The best-selling item. It's simple here. He caught himself already doing the math, automatically. Like breathing. 29 years in logistics can't be erased, not even by death. A stack of papers lay on the table by the wall. He walked over and began to read. The letters were unfamiliar, but he understood every word. They were I owe us. 6 of them. The total amount was 80 gold pieces. The interest rates were extortionate. The handwriting on the notes was shaky. The man who signed them was in despair. The man who signed them later hanged himself in this very room. And now, sitting in his place was a category manager from Seoul, examining the structure of the debt. And the structure was interesting. 2 of the 6 creditors held more than half the total amount. The remaining 4 were small players. If he bought out the smaller debts through assignment and consolidated them into a single package, he could negotiate a restructuring with the major creditors. A classic scheme. He'd done this himself when a supplier went bankrupt and he needed to save the product line. He put the receipts back on the table and looked at his hands. Someone else's hands. Young, 23 years old, if the reflection in the cloudy copper mirror on the wall was to be believed. A gaunt face with dark circles under the eyes. Sharp cheekbones, chapped lips. This guy hadn't been eating well for the past few weeks, maybe even months. He died because he saw no way out. But Min-jae looked at those same numbers and saw at least 3. The shop door creaked. He flinched. A woman stood in the doorway. She was short, wearing a dark apron over a simple dress. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was calm, but her eyes were red. She looked at him silently. Then she said she thought he was dead, that she'd found him that morning and cut the rope, that his daughters were frightened by the scream, so she had sent them to the neighbors. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know who this woman was, but he saw that she had brought a clay bowl of rice and a mug of water with her. She set them on the table next to the IOUs and said he needed to eat. Then she turned and left. He stood in silence, listening to a stranger's heart beating in a stranger's chest. Then he sat down at the table. He picked up the bowl. The rice was warm. He ate every last grain, and it was the best rice he'd ever had in both of his lives. After eating, he stood up and began to work. He dragged all the sacks out into the light. He sorted through the peppers. He separated the damp from the dry. He spread the damp pepper in a thin layer on a wooden tray by the window where the sun shone most intensely. He untied the cinnamon and began breaking the sticks into small pieces. He found a stone mortar in the corner and ground the first batch into powder. The scent hit his nose, and for a second, everything felt right. Just good. He'd been working all day. By evening, he had 12 small bags of ground cinnamon tied with clean twine, 3 separate portions of pepper, the dry ones in a good container, and a clear plan for tomorrow. He lay down on the same straw where he'd woken up that morning. He closed his eyes, and he thought that in a past life, he would have called this crisis management. But here, it was simply called survival. Min-jae woke up in the body of the owner of a spice shop in the city of Yeonhee, who had hanged himself. He discovered a debt of 80 gold pieces and inventory in poor condition. His neighbor, the widow Yuna, saved him from death and brought him food. Min-jae began to organize the inventory using the logistics skills he'd acquired in his past life. The morning began with a knock on the door, loud and impatient. Min-jae opened his eyes and for a few seconds couldn't figure out where he was. Then he remembered. A filthy shop, a body that wasn't his own, and a debt of 80 gold pieces. He stood up and opened the door. A man stood on the threshold, broad-shouldered, with a red face and small, angry eyes. Behind him stood 2 others, younger, with clubs strapped to their belts. The man said he'd come for the money, that the deadline on the 2 IOUs had expired 3 days ago, that he'd been patient enough, and that if Lee Min-jae didn't pay 12 gold pieces by the end of the week, the shop would be his. And Min-jae himself, he would sell him to a labor camp in the mines. Min-jae stood in the doorway and listened. He didn't interrupt. He looked at the moneylender and saw no threat. He saw a negotiating position. This man had come in person, with 2 bodyguards, not 5. That meant he wasn't confident. It meant he too had money problems. The embargo was hitting everyone, even those who lend money. When the moneylender fell silent, Min-jae calmly replied. He said he would pay, not 12, but 14. But not in a week, but in 2. And not with money, but with goods at market price. Pepper. The moneylender frowned. Min-jae added that pepper currently costs 3 silver coins per measure at the Yeonhee market, but at the eastern outpost, where the imperial garrison is stationed, they buy it for 5 because caravans don't go there due to the embargo. If the moneylender accepts the goods here for 3 and resells them there for 5, his profit will cover the interest and leave him with a surplus. The moneylender was silent. His eyes were doing the math. Min-jae saw this and waited. Then the moneylender asked where a penniless shopkeeper had gotten so much pepper. Min-jae replied that it was his problem, not the lender's. What mattered to the lender was the result. The moneylender snorted. Then he said he'd give him 10 days, not 14. He turned and left. His bodyguards followed him out. Min-jae closed the door and exhaled. His hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists and waited for the trembling to stop. 10 days. He didn't have 14 gold pieces worth of pepper. He barely had enough for 3. But now he had time and a specific task, and he knew how to solve problems. First thing he did, he went to the market. The Yeonhee market turned out to be small and dreary. Half the stalls were closed. At the ones that were open, the merchandise was sparse and expensive. Imperial inspectors stood at the entrance, checking business licenses. Min-jae walked past them calmly. He had the license belonging to the body's former owner, and so far, no one knew that the owner had changed. At the market, he found what he was looking for. Near the far pier, a dock worker was arguing with the warehouse manager. The dispute was over 3 crates of southern lemons. The shipment had arrived by river 2 weeks earlier. The recipient hadn't shown up. He'd probably been arrested. Or perhaps he'd gone bankrupt. The lemons had started to rot on the outside. The warehouse was demanding storage fees. The dock worker was demanding unloading fees. No one wanted to pay for disposal. Min-jae walked over and offered to take the whole lot for a single copper coin. The loader looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he shrugged and agreed. Min-jae hauled 3 crates into his shop in 2 hours. His back ached. His hands were covered in sticky lemon juice. But when he opened the crates and began sorting through them, he saw exactly what he'd expected. The top layer was rotten, but underneath lay dozens of lemons that were still firm. Not perfect, a little soft. With spots, but usable. He divided everything into 3 categories. First, completely rotten. Squeeze the juice out. Second, soft but intact. Pickling. Third, firm with defects. Zest and sold by the piece. He squeezed the juice from the rotten ones. He found some cane sugar in the store, old but still good. He boiled the juice with the sugar on a small stove in the back room until the mixture thickened. He poured it into 6 small clay jars he found in the corner. He covered each one with a rag and tied it shut with twine. Southern lemon jam. In this world, where southern fruits don't reach the northern provinces due to the embargo, such a thing was expensive. He made a pickle out of the whole, soft lemons. He sliced them thinly. He sprinkled them with salt from his 3rd sack. He added ground red pepper, which he found a little of at the bottom of one of the sacks. He packed it tightly into a jar and sealed it with a lid. It will be ready in 3 days, a sour, spicy appetizer to go with rice vodka. Taverns will buy it. From the peels of the remaining lemons, he cut thin strips and laid them out to dry on the same tray where the peppers had dried yesterday. Dried lemon peel. Pastry chefs and apothecaries use it for baking and medicinal decoctions. The next morning, he took the jars of jam to the apothecary 2 streets away. The old man sniffed it. He tasted a bit on the tip of his finger, and he bought all 6 for 40 copper coins. Min-jae said it was a southern jam for colds. The old man nodded and asked if there would be more. Min-jae replied that it depended on the shipments, that he stopped by the tavern near the market square. The owner was a sullen man with a scarred hand. Min-jae offered to let him try the pickles in 3 days, a free tasting. The owner agreed suspiciously. That evening he sold the dried zest to a pastry chef on the next street for 20 copper coins. The pastry chef was surprised. He said he hadn't seen southern zest since the embargo began. Min-jae returned to the shop and sat down at the table. He did the math. 60 kopecks for the jam, 20 for the zest. In 3 days there would be more revenue from the pickling. From 3 crates of rotten lemons bought for a single kopeck. And just as he placed the last coins on the table, something happened. Inside, between his ribs, warm and ringing, as if a coin had fallen into an empty clay pot. He froze. The sound repeated, quieter, deeper. And for a moment, words flashed before his eyes that no one but him could see. Mana of the stream. 4. He didn't understand what it meant, but he felt it. It was right. He'd earned it. He sat in the darkening shop and smiled slowly. For the first time since waking up in a stranger's body, the loan shark came to collect the debt and gave Min-jae 10 days. Min-jae bought 3 crates of rotten lemons for a copper coin and turned them into jam, pickles, and zest. He made his first profit and felt his ability activate for the first time. Stream mana is equal to 4 dot. On the 4th day after waking up, Min-jae sat on the shop floor and drew with a stick on a clay tile. Numbers, columns, arrows. He was calculating. He didn't yet understand how to use the 4 gold of mana, but he understood perfectly well that he'd made a real profit of 4 gold pieces in 3 days with 0 investment. The problem was the scale. To pay the moneylender 14 gold pieces in goods, he needed 3.5 times more income over the remaining 6 days. There were no more lemons. It was unclear when the next shipment from the river would arrive. He needed a different product. He needed a different plan. He went out onto the street and walked along Yeonhee. He looked around. He listened. He calculated. The town was small, 3,000 residents. It stood at the crossroads of 3 roads leading to 3 different provinces. Before the embargo, Life here had been bustling. Now the checkpoints on all 3 roads were closed. Imperial soldiers inspected every cart. A trading license cost 5 gold pieces a year. It used to cost 1 silver piece. Half the shopkeepers had closed their businesses. Those who remained sold only local goods. And there were few local goods. Yeon-hee stood on the stony ground. Almost nothing grew here except turnips and bitter greens. The town's main resource had always been its location, a crossroads, a place where 3 streams of goods converged. Now those streams had been cut off, and the town was slowly suffocating. Min-jae stopped by the well in the market square and thought. In his past life, he had seen something similar, a small village in Chungcheong province that was dying after its only factory closed. His company had opened a distribution center there, not because it was profitable, but because there were people there who needed jobs. And a year later, the village came back to life. Not because of money, because movement. Goods passed through the village, and life sprang up around them. Drivers stopped for lunch. Lunch gave rise to cafes. Cafes created jobs. Jobs created demand. Demand created new shops. It was a flow. That very flow. Min-jae suddenly realized something important. The word mana. The word flow. It wasn't a coincidence. This ability was about the same thing, the flow of value between people. He returned to the shop and sprang into action. First thing, he went to see Yuna. She lived in the house next door. A small yard, clean, poor but not run down, laundry on a line, pots of herbs by the wall. Yuna was sitting on the threshold, mending her daughter's shoes. Min-jae sat down next to her and began to speak. He said he wanted to open a small cafe in the shop. 1 dish a day, simple and hot, at cost. Not for profit from the food, but for the people who'd come to eat. Because everyone who came in for a bowl of porridge would see the spices, sauces, and packaged mixes on the shelves. And they'd buy something to take home. Foot traffic generates sales. Yuna listened in silence. Then she asked how he would pay for the ingredients. Min-jae replied that there was no need to buy ingredients. They just needed to make an arrangement. He proposed a plan to her. She had rice, a little bit. Her neighbor Che had turnips. Old Man Park had firewood. Everyone in town had one thing. If everyone gave a little and received in return a bowl of hot food made from what everyone had contributed, then no one would spend any money, and everyone would be fed. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she said that he was either very smart or completely crazy. Min-jae replied that, in his experience, those 2 things were usually one and the same. Yuna didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. She said she knew how to cook, and that if he got the ingredients, she'd make it. They shook hands. Min-jae spent the rest of the day going around to the neighbors. He knocked on doors. He talked. He explained. Most of them looked at him with suspicion. A young shopkeeper who had been hanging by a noose yesterday and today was going door to door offering some kind of scheme. But Min-jae wasn't asking for money. He was asking for a turnip, a handful of dried mushrooms, a bunch of greens, a single carrot. In exchange, he gave a small bag of ground cinnamon, just 10 grams. But the cinnamon smelled good, and people who hadn't smelled cinnamon in months took it. By evening, he had enough ingredients for 1 large pot. Yuna arrived at sunset. Silently, she washed her hands. Silently, she lit the stove. And she cooked a porridge with turnips and mushrooms so fragrant that the aroma wafted out of the shop onto the street and reached the market square. Min-jae set up a small table by the door. The pot stood on it. Next to it was a stack of bowls. Beside that was a sign written in his own hand. Hot porridge, 1 copper coin per bowl. The first 3 bowls are free. Old Man Park was the first to arrive. He had given them firewood. He ate a bowl in silence. Then he looked at the shelves with cinnamon and pepper, and he bought a small bag of pepper for 2 copper coins. The second to arrive was a dock worker, the very same one from whom Min-jae had bought lemons. He ate 2 bowls. He bought a jar of lemon jam. He said his wife had a cough. By nightfall, the pot was empty. 23 bowls, 20 copper coins for the porridge, and 45 copper coins for the spices and sauces bought by those who came to eat. Min-jae stood in the empty shop and counted again. Yuna was washing dishes by the water barrel. Her daughter, a 7-year-old girl with pigtails, sat in the corner drawing with a stick on a clay tile. Min-jae looked at them and thought that in his past life, this was called in-store tasting marketing tied to the point of sale. And in this life, it was simply called dinner. The warm ringing between his ribs grew slightly louder. Mana of the flow. 6. Min-jae explored the city and realized that the key to survival was restoring the flow of goods through people. He made an agreement with Yuna and the neighbors, creating a system for exchanging food for spices. He opened a mini cafe next to the shop, which brought in customers and sales. Mana had grown to 6. On the 6th day, the loan shark sent one of his men to check on things. A guy with a truncheon walked into the shop in the morning. He looked around. He saw shelves lined with neat little bags of cinnamon and pepper, jars of jam, a pot of pickled lemons that Min-jae had taken out yesterday and brought to the tavern. The tavern keeper had tasted them and ordered 5 more pots. The guy with the truncheon didn't say a word. He looked at Min-jae. He looked at Yuna, who was wiping down the table. He turned around and left. Min-jae realized that time was running out. 4 days until the deadline. He had 7 gold pieces. He needed 14. Exactly twice as much as he had. He sat down and thought. The challenge wasn't to earn another 7 gold pieces in 4 days. The challenge was to change the terms. In his past life, when a supplier pressed him for deadlines, Min-jae didn't try to speed up production. He renegotiated the contract. He restructured the deal. He made it so that it would be in the supplier's own interest to wait. He took out the IOUs and laid them out on the table. 6 creditors, 2 major ones, 4 minor ones. The major one who had come by was named Jung Tae-soo. The second major one was a moneylender from the neighboring district named Bae-song. The 4 minor ones were shopkeepers who had lent the former Min-jae small sums out of friendship or habit. Min-jae went to the smaller creditors. The first was an elderly woman who sold fabrics. The former Min-jae owed her 3 gold pieces. Min-jae went to see her and spoke plainly. "I have no money, but I have goods." He offered to settle the debt with pepper at market price. 3 gold pieces equaled 12 measures of pepper. He had 10 measures of dried, sorted pepper. He offered 10 measures plus 2 small bags of ground cinnamon on top as compensation for the delay. The woman thought it over. She didn't need the pepper, but she knew that in the eastern garrison, pepper sold for 5 silver coins. She agreed. The second small creditor was an old man who sold earthenware. The debt was 1.5 gold coins. Min-jae offered him a different kind of deal. He needed pots and jars for packaging, a lot of them. If the old man would write off the debt and supply Min-jae with 50 jars right away, Min-jae would buy all his pottery for the next 6 months. A steady order. A stable income. The old man, whose sales had dropped by 2/3 during the embargo, agreed without hesitation. The third and fourth creditors proved to be more difficult. One had left town. The second refused to talk and slammed the door. Min-jae didn't press the issue. Their debts were small, 2 gold coins each. He would return to them later. In total, he settled 4.5 gold coins worth of debt without spending a single coin. Just goods and promises. Promises he intended to keep. That was important. He could feel it physically. Every time he gave his word and both sides were satisfied, the warm ringing inside him became a little clearer. The mana of the flow. 8. He was beginning to understand the pattern. Mana didn't grow from money. Mana grew from the fairness of the exchange. When he offered the old potter a standing order and the man smiled for the first time in a month, the ringing was louder than from selling jam to the apothecary. Although the deal with the apothecary was larger in terms of money, the system rewarded not the amount, but the value. Not for himself, but for another. On the 7th day, something he hadn't expected happened. He was sitting in his shop, counting his stock, when a new line flashed before his eyes. Skill available. Path of demand. Cost, 10 mana units. Current balance, 8. He stared at those words. 10. He needed 2 more units, 2 fair exchanges. He stepped out of the shop. A light drizzle was falling outside. The tavern owner, with a scorched hand, was standing at the door arguing with someone inside. Min Jae approached. It turned out the tavern keeper had run out of salt. The supplier hadn't delivered it. The checkpoint wouldn't let it through. And without salt, he couldn't cook and was losing customers by the hour. Min Jae returned to the shop. He took out his bag of salt, coarse, gray salt. He had 4 measures left. He scooped out 2 and took them to the innkeeper. The price was fair, market price, with no markup for the urgency. The innkeeper wanted to pay more. Min Jae refused. He said that he might need the innkeeper's help tomorrow, and that a good deed is worth more than a silver coin. The innkeeper looked at him strangely. Then he nodded and paid exactly what was due. Stream manna, 9. In the evening, Yuna came as usual to cook porridge. There were more people than usual. 31 bowls. One of the customers was a traveling merchant. He was traveling from the southern province and had gotten stuck at the checkpoint. He was carrying rice, but his documents had been held up. He needed somewhere to store his goods. Min Jae offered him the back room of the shop, for free, for 3 days. The merchant was surprised. He asked what the catch was. Min Jae replied that there was no catch. But if the merchant sold him 2 sacks of rice at cost, they'd both be satisfied. The merchant agreed. The rice at cost was half the market price. Min Jae shook his hand. Manna potok. 10. The ringing inside changed. It grew deeper, and something new unfolded before his eyes. Not words, a sensation, as if a map had appeared inside his head, blurry, flickering. He closed his eyes and concentrated, and he saw, or rather, he sensed, the eastern outpost, a garrison, 40 soldiers. They're short on soap and cooking oil. They're willing to pay triple the price. The northern road, a village halfway along the route. There's honey there, lots of honey, but there are no buyers because the outpost is closed. The southern pier, fishermen. They have a surplus of dried fish. They can't sell it and will soon have to throw it away. The path of demand. The skill was working. It showed him where things were needed and where they were available. Supply and demand. The distance between them. And Min Jae stood right in the middle. He opened his eyes. Yuna was standing next to him, looking at him with concern. She asked if everything was all right. He replied that he was. For the first time in a week, he didn't just have a plan for tomorrow, he had a plan for the month. Min Jae had paid off some of his smaller debts through barter and debt assignment. His mana had risen to 10, and his first skill, Path of Demand, had unlocked. It allowed him to sense where there were shortages and surpluses of goods in the area. For the first time, Min Jae saw the full picture of the trade opportunities around Yeonhee. Day 8. There were 2 days left until the loan shark's deadline. Min Jae got up before dawn. The path of demand pulsed inside him like a second heartbeat. He sensed 3 points: honey in the north, fish in the south, a hungry garrison in the east. 3 points, 3 shortages, 3 opportunities, and he had to connect them all in 2 days. He started with the fish. He went to the southern pier before the fishermen had even pulled their boats out. He found the foreman, a sturdy man with a weather-beaten face and hands scarred by fishing nets. Min Jae spoke to him directly. He asked how much dried fish was lying around unused. The head fisherman looked at him suspiciously. Then he waved his hand toward a shed on the shore. Min Jae peeked inside. 4 large baskets of dried fish. Each weighed as much as a good-sized piglet. The fish wasn't being sold at the Yeonhee market because everyone had the same kind. The town stood on the river. Everyone ate fish. No one needed any more fish. But at the eastern outpost, the soldiers in the garrison had been eating only government-issued porridge for 2 months straight. Min Jae offered the fisherman a deal. He'd take all 4 baskets. He'd pay 1 silver coin per basket. The market price was 3 silver coins. But the market price only made sense when there was a market. And there was no market. The fish was rotting. 1 silver coin for something that would be trash in a week, that was a good price. The fisherman haggled. Min Jae wouldn't budge. Not because he was greedy, but because he physically didn't have any more money. He explained this plainly. He said he could pay 1 silver coin per basket now, and in a week, if the deal worked out, pay another silver coin on top of that. The fisherman agreed. Min-jae paid 4 silver coins and hired 2 teenagers from the pier to haul the baskets to his stall. He paid them a copper coin each. The mana of the stream chimed. 11. Then copper. The northern village was a half-day's journey away. He had to pass through the outpost. The outpost was guarded by an imperial patrol. 4 soldiers. Min-jae approached the outpost with a sack on his back. Inside the sack were small bags of ground cinnamon and 2 pots of pickled lemons. The soldiers stopped him. They asked where he was going. Min-jae replied that he was going to visit relatives in the village. He was carrying gifts. The senior soldier peered into the sack. He sniffed the cinnamon. He looked at the pickles. And he asked how much a pot cost. Min-jae sold him a pot for 3 silver coins. A fair price. The soldier paid and let him pass. Min-jae walked along the road, thinking that the best contraband is the kind that customs buys. In the village, he found a beekeeper, an old man with 3 hives and a cellar full of honey in clay pots. The honey was dark and thick, mountain honey, the expensive kind. In the capital, a pot like that would cost a gold coin. Here, the old man couldn't sell it even for a silver coin, because the village was cut off from the world. Min-jae bought 10 pots of honey for 1 silver coin each. 10 silver coins. That was almost all the cash he had. He left the old man a small bag of cinnamon as a gift. The old man was touched. He said he hadn't smelled cinnamon in 2 years. Min-jae wrapped the pots in cloth. He packed them into 2 sacks. The return trip was hard. The honey was heavy. His back ached. His legs buzzed. At the checkpoint, the same soldiers looked at his sacks. Min-jae sold them the 2nd jar of pickles. They let him through. By evening, he returned to Yonhee. He collapsed onto the straw in the shop. Yuna came in with some porridge. He ate it and fell asleep right at the table. The 9th day. The last one before the deadline. Min-jae got up and began to count. 4 baskets of fish. 10 pots of honey. 12 small bags of cinnamon. 8 measures of pepper. Salt. Pickled fish. Jam. All of this had to be turned into 14 gold pieces by tomorrow morning. He took 1 basket of fish and carried it to the eastern outpost. It was a 2-hour walk. The garrison stood on a hill. Gray walls. A banner bearing the imperial coat of arms. The soldiers at the gate looked tired and hungry. Min-jae asked to see the quartermaster. He was escorted inside. The quartermaster was a young officer with ink stains on his fingers. Min-jae laid out the goods before him. Dried fish, southern honey, pepper, cinnamon, salt. The quartermaster looked at it all like a man who sees water after a week in the desert. Min-jae named his prices. Fair prices, not market prices. Lower. Because he needed a regular customer, not a one-time deal. The quartermaster did the math. Then he said he didn't have the authority to approve such a large sum. Min-jae asked what amount he was authorized for. The quartermaster replied that he could spend up to 5 gold pieces a month on additional supplies. Min-jae did the math instantly. He offered half the goods for 4 gold pieces right away, the rest on credit, with a commitment to purchase 3 months' worth in advance. The quartermaster thought it over. Min-jae remained silent. He didn't press the issue. He waited. The quartermaster agreed. 4 gold coins landed in Min-jae's palm. They were warm from the officer's hands. The ringing inside him grew distinct. Stream mana. 15. He walked back, counting as he went. He had 7 gold coins. 4 had been received. Minus 4 silver coins for the fish. Minus 10 silver coins for the honey. Minus small expenses. In total, he had about 10 gold coins in cash. He needed 14. He was short. 4 gold pieces for 1 night. He walked along the road and thought. The path of demand pulsed. It showed him that the tavern keeper was looking for cooking oil, that the pastry chef was ready to buy honey at 3 silver coins per pot, that the village headman's house was running out of good tea, and the headman's wife would be happy with any tea from the southern provinces. Min-jae stopped. He took a deep breath, and he ran. For the next 6 hours, he didn't stop. He delivered 3 pots of honey to the pastry chef, 9 silver. He sold the remaining salted fish to the tavern keeper, 6 silver coins. He sold the basket of fish piece by piece to the night workers at the pier. Small change, but it all added up. He brewed a fragrant mixture from dried citrus peel and honey and sold it to the apothecary as a remedy for winter coughs. He stopped by the village headman's wife's house. He gave her a small bag of ground cinnamon, for free. He said it was out of respect for her husband, who keeps the town in order. The village headman's wife was touched. She asked if he had any tea. Min-jae replied that he didn't have any yet, but he would soon. He made a mental note. This wasn't a transaction. It was an investment. By midnight, he was sitting in his shop, counting his money one last time. The coins lay on the table in neat stacks. 13 gold and 6 silver. He was 4 silver coins short of 14. He looked at the stacks and thought. Yuna was sitting across from him. She was silent. Then she stood up. She went out. She came back 10 minutes later. She placed 4 silver coins on the table. Min-jae looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the wall. He asked where they came from. She replied that it was her last bit of money, that she'd been saving it for her daughter's winter shoes, but that without this shop and without the porridge she cooked every evening, neither she nor her daughter would need shoes, because they'd have nothing to wear if the city died before winter. Min-jae took the coins. He said he'd pay her back threefold. Yuna told him not to promise what he couldn't deliver. Min-jae replied that he could. Yuna finally looked at him, and he saw that she believed, not in his words, but in him. Mana of the Stream, 18. On the morning of the 10th day, Jung Tae-soo came to collect the debt. With him were the same 2 men with clubs. Min-jae laid 14 gold coins on the table, in a neat stack. The loan shark counted them in silence, twice. Then he looked at Min-jae. He asked how. Myung-jae replied that it was his professional secret. The moneylender smirked. He took the money. He left. At the threshold, he turned around and said that the remaining debt was with Bae-seon, that Bae-seon wasn't so patient, and that Myung-jae should hurry up. The door closed. Min-jae stood in the empty shop. 14 gold coins had been paid. 6 silver coins remained in his pocket. Jung Tae-soo's debt was settled, but Bae-seon remained. Another 30 gold coins and 4 smaller debts. He sat down on the floor. He looked up at the ceiling, at that very hook from which a dead body had been taken down a week ago, and he thought that the old Min-jae had seen the end in that ceiling. But he sees a plan for the next quarter. In 2 days, Min-jae pulled off a series of deals. He bought fish from fishermen and honey in a mountain village. He sold the goods to the garrison and the townspeople. Yuna contributed her last bit of money. The debt to the moneylender Jung Tae-soo, 14 gold pieces, was paid off. But the debt to Bae-sun, 30 gold pieces, and some smaller debts remained. Mana of the Stream had risen to 18 dot. On the 11th day after waking up, Min-jae sat in the shop and sketched out a debt chart on a clay tile. Bae-sun, 30 gold pieces, 2 small creditors, 2 gold pieces each, total 34. 6 silver pieces in his pocket, a 3-month contract with the garrison, 5 regular customers at the cafe, and the path of demand skill, which pulsed inside him like a compass pointing to others' needs. That wasn't enough. Min-jae understood that. He could trade in sacks of cinnamon and jars of honey for the rest of his life and still not make 30 gold pieces a month. The scale wasn't right. He needed a different model. In his previous life, when his supermarket opened a new location in a loss-making neighborhood, he didn't try to make money on sales. He built foot traffic. People came for cheap bread and left with a full shopping basket. The bread was a money loser. The basket was a moneymaker, a loss leader, an anchor product. Min-jae stood up and walked over to the tavern owner. The tavern owner was sitting at the bar, sharpening a knife. His burned hand lay on the table. Min-jae sat down across from him and began to speak. He proposed a plan. Every evening, he would deliver one unique dish to the tavern, not something any cook could make, but something only Yuna could prepare using his recipes. with southern spices, a lemon brine, honey, and cinnamon. It would be the dish of the day, with a new one every day. The tavern owner would sell it at his own price. Min-jae takes only the cost of the ingredients. All the profit goes to the tavern owner. In return, the tavern owner places a small sign on every table. Spices and sauces by Lee Min-jae. Shop on Chestnut Street. The tavern owner listened. Then he asked what the benefit was for Min-jae if he gave up the profit. Min-jae replied that his benefit was that every evening 40 people would see his name. And 10 of them would come to the shop. And 3 out of 10 would buy something. The tavern owner didn't understand the word traffic, but he understood the phrase free food for resale. He agreed. They shook hands. Min-jae returned to the shop and told Yoon about it. She listened while wiping her hands on her apron. Then she said she couldn't handle it alone. Cooking porridge for 30 people and a separate dish for the tavern every evening was too much. Min-jae nodded. He knew. That was exactly why he went to the pier. There he found a woman he'd seen a few times before. She was sitting on the steps by the water, mending her nets. Thin, hands covered in calluses. A fisherman's widow. 2 children. Her name was Han Soon-yi. Min-jae offered her a job, as a kitchen helper. Payment would be food for her and the children, plus 5 copper coins a day. Han Soon-yi looked at him as if he'd offered her the moon. Then she asked when to start. Min-jae replied, "Right now." She stood up and followed him. By evening, there were 2 people working in the shop. Yoona was in charge. Han Soon-yi chopped vegetables quickly and precisely. Min-jae carried water and firewood. For the tavern, they prepared porridge with dried fish, soothing with honey and hot peppers. It was a recipe from his past life, Korean chuk with tuna, except that river fish was used instead of tuna and vegetable oil instead of sesame oil. The tavern keeper tasted it and silently gave it a thumbs up. That evening, the tavern was packed. The dish went fast. 3 people asked where they could buy the spices used in the porridge. The innkeeper pointed to the sign. The next morning, all 3 came to Min-jae's shop. They bought cinnamon and pepper. One asked about honey. Min-jae sold him a pot for 3 silver coins. The flywheel began to turn. The path of demand suggested something else to him. 2 days' journey to the south lay the fishing village of Namhae. There was oil there, fish oil. It tasted disgusting, but was indispensable for cooking and for lanterns. There had been no oil in Yonhee for a month. Only every other street lamp was lit. People were cooking in dry pans. Oil was a magnet for business. If he brought oil to Yonhee, the city would come to him. But to do that, he had to get to Namhae, through the checkpoint, with his goods, and return. A 4-day journey. He couldn't leave the shop for 4 days. Yoona could handle the kitchen. But who would sell? Who would keep track of the accounts? Who would negotiate? He sat there in the evening thinking. Stream mana, 21. The line flashed before his eyes again. Skill available. Pocket storage. Cost, 20 mana units. 21 in reserve. He concentrated and activated it. The sensation was strange, as if a door had opened inside him to a room that didn't exist. A small, dark room, about the size of a closet. He reached out and mentally placed the little bag of cinnamon from the table inside. The bag vanished. It simply vanished from reality. He reached inside again, and the bag returned to his hand. Warm and smelling just the same. A pocket warehouse, a folded-up space, still small for now, about the size of a closet, but big enough to carry goods without a cart, without sacks on his back, invisibly, past any checkpoint. Min-jae sat on the floor of the shop, holding the little bag of cinnamon that had just been to another dimension. And he thought that in a past life, Amazon would have paid $1 trillion for such seamless delivery technology. On the 13th day, he set out on his journey. He left Yoona clear instructions. She listened and nodded. He could see she was nervous. Not because of the work, because he was leaving. She had gotten used to him being around. She'd gotten used to it in 12 days. Min-jae said he'd be back in 3 days. Yoona replied that if he didn't come back, she knew where the rope and the hook were. He froze. She looked at him without a smile. Then her eyes softened, and she said she was joking. That in reality, she'd sell his goods for double the price and run off with the money. Min-jae laughed. For the first time in 2 weeks, he laughed from the bottom of his heart. He left Yeon-hee empty-handed but with a full pocket store. Cinnamon, pepper, lemon jam, honey. Everything was hidden in the space that traveled with him. At the checkpoint, the soldiers searched him and found only copper coins in his pocket. They let him through. The road south wound through hills covered with low shrubs. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke from distant villages. Min-jae walked and did the math in his head. If oil in Namhae costs 1 silver per measure, and there's none at all in Yeon-hee, then I can sell it for 3 silvers per measure. That's 2 silver pieces net per measure. If I bring 20 measures, that's 40 silver pieces net. 4 gold pieces, for 1 trip. 2 trips a week. 8 gold pieces a week. In a month, Bae-sun's debt could be paid off. But that's only if he makes the trips himself. His legs won't hold up. He needs a partner. He needs a transporter. He needs someone with a cart and the drive to do it. He reached Namhae by the end of the 2nd day. The village was poor and smelled of fish. 10 houses by the water, fishing nets on every fence, and barrels of oil. He found the village headman and proposed a deal. Min-jae would buy the oil at 1 silver per measure. He'd take 20 measures. He'd pay right away. In return, he asked the village head to find him a cart driver willing to make the trip to Yeon-hee once a week. The village head said there was a driver, his son. There was a cart. There was a horse. But the road through the checkpoint was closed. Min-jae replied that the checkpoint was his problem. The village elder looked at him for a long time. Then he asked what Min-jae would bring them in return. The village needed salt, and medicine, and cloth. Min-jae said he would bring them. The sergeant nodded. They shook hands. Min-jae paid 20 silver coins. That was all the money he had left. He loaded 10 measures of oil into the pocket storehouse. He left the remaining 10 for the cart driver. The return trip took a day and a half. He practically ran. At the outpost, the soldiers searched him again. They found nothing. Min-jae arrived in Yeon-hee at sunset on the 15th day. Yuna was standing by the shop door. She saw him and let out a sigh. She didn't say a word. She just went to make tea. He stepped inside. He placed 10 measures of oil on the table. Yuna turned around. She looked at the oil. She looked at his empty hands. She looked at the oil again. She asked where it came from. Min-jae replied that this, too, was his professional secret. Yuna shook her head and poured him some tea. Min-jae formed a partnership with the tavern to promote his spices. He hired a second assistant, Han Sun-yi. He unlocked the pocket storage skill. He made his first trading expedition to Namhae village for oil. He established a regular oil delivery route through the outpost. Mana continues to grow. The oil changed everything. Min-jae put 10 measures up for sale at 3 silver coins per measure. By noon, only 2 remained. People came and bought them right away. No haggling, no questions asked. Cooking oil in a city where people had been frying food in dry pans for a month was like water in the desert. No one needed to be told how valuable it was. 30 silver coins in a day. 3 gold coins, net. Mana of the stream. 26. But the most important thing wasn't the oil. The most important thing was what happened at the counter. Old Man Park, who had been coming for porridge since day 1, was standing in line for oil. His neighbor stood next to him. They were talking. The old man said that Min-jae always had what others didn't. The neighbor nodded. She asked if there would be flour. Min-jae heard her. The path of demand lit up. Flour. The northern province. Mills at the mountain pass. 30 measures of flour are sitting unsold because the caravan to the capital didn't make it through the closed route. Min-jae made a note. Flour, butter, honey, fish, pepper, cinnamon, salt, lemons. 8 items, 8 lines of demand. Each connected 2 places that couldn't trade directly with one another. And he stood right in the middle. A crossroads man. On the 16th day, a cart driver arrived from Namhae. a young man with a broad face and calm eyes. His name was Tang Gu-ho. He brought 10 measures of oil on his cart. Min-jae met him at the southern outpost. The soldiers inspected the goods. Min-jae showed his trading license. He paid the duty, 1 silver coin. The soldiers let them through. Tang Gu-ho looked at Min-jae with curiosity. He asked how Min-jae had made it on foot with his goods through the same outpost 3 days earlier if he hadn't had a cart. Min-jae replied that he was traveling light. Tang Gu-ho didn't believe him but didn't argue. Min-jae paid him 1 silver coin for the delivery. Tang Gu-ho said it wasn't enough. Min-jae said that 1 silver coin for a day's journey was the standard rate for a caravan driver. Tang Gu-ho replied that caravan drivers don't take risks at checkpoints. Min-jae thought about it. The young man was right. He raised the rate to 1.5 silver coins, plus a meal at the inn for each delivery. Tang Gu-ho smiled and agreed. Min-jae looked at him and didn't see a driver. He saw the first link in the supply chain, the first logistics specialist. On the 17th day, trouble struck. Min-jae was standing behind the counter when a man in a dark cloak with a silver brooch on his collar entered the shop. The brooch was shaped like a set of scales, the symbol of the Great Spice Guild. The man introduced himself. Assistant Inspector Hwang Moon-ju. He said that rumors had reached the guild about a shop in Yonhee that was selling southern spices without a guild license. Min-jae replied calmly. He showed his business license. It was valid, paid for a year in advance by the previous owner of the body. The assistant inspector examined the license. The license granted the right to trade spices within the city limits, but did not grant the right to purchase goods outside the province. Min-jae replied that all his purchases were local. Oil from Namhae. Namhae is in the same province. Honey from a northern village. Same province. Lemons bought from a dock worker at the Yonhee pier. Technically correct. The assistant jotted everything down in his notebook. Then he looked at the shelves, at the neat little bags and jars, at the line of 4 people at the counter, and said that Inspector Hwang Moon-ju would be coming in person in a week, that he was advised to have all the ledgers ready, and that he was strongly advised to consider getting a guild license. The cost of the license, 50 gold pieces a year. The assistant turned and left. Min-jae stood behind the counter and thought, 50 gold pieces. He hadn't even paid off his 30 gold debt yet, and now he needed another 50. Or maybe not. He knew how inspections worked. In his past life, his supermarket was inspected 4 times a year. The tax office, the sanitary and epidemiological station, the fire department, Rospotrebnadzor. The same thing every time. They come, they look for violations, they find them. They fine you or hint at a bribe. But if there are no violations, if every piece of paperwork is in order, if every number adds up, then the inspector leaves empty-handed. And an inspector who leaves empty-handed is an inspector who gets angry. But anger without a basis is powerless. Min-jae spent the next 4 days preparing for the inspection. He started a ledger, a thick one, made of good paper bought from a stationer for 7 kopecks. He recorded every transaction from day 1, every purchase, every sale, the date, the name, the quantity, the price, the source of the goods. He recorded them just as he'd been taught in the accounting courses he'd taken at age 22 in Seoul, because he wanted to understand what the finance department was saying. Yuna looked at his ledger and shook her head. She had never seen a shopkeeper keep such records. Min-jae explained that it's called double-entry bookkeeping. Every transaction is recorded twice, income and expense, debit and credit. Yuna said she didn't understand. Min-jae replied that she didn't need to. The main thing was that the inspector would understand. Meanwhile, he didn't stop trading. Tang Gu-ho delivered the second shipment of oil, 20 measures. Min-jae sold half of it in a single day. He set the rest aside for the garrison. The quartermaster sent a messenger asking for more fish and oil. Min-jae loaded up the pocket store and delivered it personally. He received 3 gold pieces. In his calculations, his debt to Bae-sun had decreased to 21 gold pieces. Mana of the stream, 34. On the 21st day, Bae-sun entered the shop, the second major creditor. Unlike Jung Tae-soo, he came alone, without a bodyguard. Short, lean, with an expressionless face, He sat down on a chair at the counter and waited in silence. Min-jae poured him some tea. Bae-sun took a sip. Then he said he'd heard that Min-jae had settled Jung Tae-soo's debt, that he was impressed, that he wanted to propose a deal. If Min-jae paid 20 gold pieces instead of 30 right now, the debt would be settled. A discount for early repayment. Min-jae looked at him and saw the trap. He didn't have 20 gold pieces right now. He had 11. If he said yes and didn't pay, Bae-sung would have grounds for immediate collection. If he said no, he'd lose the chance to save 10 gold pieces. Min-jae did what he'd learned from negotiating with soju suppliers in Itaewon. He said neither yes nor no. He asked when the deadline was. Bae-sung replied, "In a month." Min-jae said he'd pay 22. Not 20, 22, but in 3 weeks. Bae-sung asked why 22 and not 20. Min-jae replied that the extra 2 gold pieces were payment for his patience and for his respect for his word. A moneylender who gives a discount deserves a bonus. Bae-sung finished his tea. He set down his cup and said he agreed. 3 weeks, 22 gold pieces. He stood up and left. Min-jae exhaled. 3 weeks, 22 gold pieces, minus the 11 he already had on hand. He needed 11 more. 3 or 4 gold pieces a week. Realistic. Tough, but doable. He clenched his fists and looked at the ledger. Then he picked up a brush and wrote a new entry. Debt to Bae-sun. Restructured. 22 gold pieces, due in 3 weeks. And for the first time ever, he saw that the numbers added up. Not perfectly, a stretch, but they added up. Min-jae had set up regular oil deliveries through the cart driver Tang Gu-ho. An assistant inspector from the Spice Guild had warned of an audit in a week. Min-jae kept complete accounting records. The moneylender Bae-sun offered a discount, and Min-jae negotiated a rate of 22 gold pieces for 3 weeks. Mana had risen to 30-4. The 23rd day. 1 week until Inspector Hwang Moon's inspection. Min-jae hadn't slept. Not because he was afraid, because he was working. Every morning he got up before dawn. He checked the merchandise. He counted the inventory. He recorded it in the ledger. Then he went to the market, then to the tavern, then to the pier, then back to the shop. Yuna cooked. Han Sung, I helped out. Tan Gu-ho delivered oil every 4 days. The cafe was open every evening. 35 bowls on average. Profits from related goods were growing. Min-jae did the math and saw that in the first month, the shop had gone from a loss to a small operating profit. Small. Shaky. But a profit. On the 24th day, a young woman walked into the shop. She was wearing a hooded raincoat. Her hands were slender. Her posture was straight, the back of someone accustomed to holding their head high. She sat down at the counter and asked for tea. Min-jae poured it for her. The young woman pulled back her hood. Her face was thin, beautiful. Dark eyes with shadows from lack of sleep. Ink stains on her fingers. She drank her tea in silence. Then she asked if he needed an assistant. Min-jae asked who she was. The girl introduced herself as So-yeon. She said she was an apothecary, that she'd come from the eastern province, that she had nowhere else to go. Min-jae looked at her hands, at the ink stains, at the gloves tucked into her belt. Thin, leather. The kind worn by those who work with herbs and powders. He asked why she had left the eastern province. So-yeon paused. Then she replied that they wanted to force her to marry a man she hadn't chosen, that she had run away at night, that she had a notebook with 200 recipes for medicinal concoctions, and that this was all she had. Min-jae listened. The path of demand pulsed within him. The apothecary 2 streets away was old and sick. His shop would close in 6 months because he had no one to pass the business on to. In the 3 villages surrounding Yonhee, there wasn't a single doctor. People treated themselves with herbs they gathered themselves, often incorrectly. The demand for medicine, huge, unmet, and sitting in front of him was a young woman with 200 recipes. Min-jae offered her a deal. Not a job, a partnership. He'd set up a workspace for her in the shop, give her access to ingredients, She'd create a product line: herbal teas for insomnia, ointments for joint pain, baby food for teething infants. Each product solves a specific problem for a specific person. They'd split the profits 50-50. So-yeon looked at him for a long time. Then she asked what if she didn't have a guild license to operate a pharmacy. Min-jae replied that a license was required for a pharmacist, not for a consultant on aromatic blends. So-yeon narrowed her eyes. Then she smiled slightly at the corner of her mouth. She said that was demagoguery. Min-jae replied that in his world, it was called legal optimization. They shook hands. So-yeon started working that very same day. She sorted through the leftover herbs in the shop. She categorized them. She threw half of them away. She reprocessed the other half. By evening, she had her first 3 blends ready. Sleep tea, made from dried mint and valerian root that she found in a bag of miscellaneous trash. An ointment for the joints, made from rendered fat and mountain herbs that she took out of her bag. And a cold remedy, made from lemon zest, honey, and ground pepper. Min-jae watched her and saw a professional. Quick, precise, confident. Ta-yeon worked with the ingredients the way he worked with spreadsheets. No unnecessary movements. Every action had a purpose. On the 25th day, Min-jae took the samples to the apothecary. The old man sniffed the ointment. He tasted the tea. He rubbed the powder between his fingers. And he said he hadn't seen such quality since his teacher died 20 years ago. He ordered 10 jars of ointment and 20 bags of sleep tea. Min-jae returned to the shop with the order in his hands and a broad smile. So-yeon took the list. She read it. She snorted. She said that if they gave her a proper desk instead of an upside-down box, she'd get everything done in 2 days. Min-jae bought her a desk. A nice one. Made of oak. From the carpenter around the corner for 7 silver coins. When Yeon didn't say anything when they brought it in, but Min-jae noticed that she ran her hand over the tabletop so gently, as if she were touching a living creature. The 26th day. Oil, fish, spices, medicinal concoctions. 4 product lines, 7 regular customers at the cafe, 2 wholesale buyers, the garrison and the apothecary, 1 cart driver, 3 employees, Yuna, Han Sun-yi, So-yeon. That evening, Min-jae sat and sketched on a clay tile what, in his past life, had been called an organizational structure. Yuna was in charge of the kitchen and the cafe. Han Sun-yi handled food preparation and packaging. So-yeon was in charge of the medicinal product line. Tang Gu-ho handled logistics for the southern region. Min-jae was responsible for purchasing, sales, strategy, finance, and negotiations. It was too much for one person. He needed someone for sales, someone who could calculate quickly and talk to people. The path of demand remained silent. It hadn't seen this demand, because it was his own demand. The 27th day, morning. A girl of about 10 ran into the shop, skinny, dirty, with a split lip. She clutched a canvas bag to her chest and looked around like a cornered animal. 2 bigger boys were running down the street after her. Yuna blocked their path. The boys stopped. Yuna asked what was going on. They said the girl had stolen bread at market. Yuna looked at the girl, then at the boys. Then she told them to get lost. The boys left. The girl stood in the corner of the shop, trembling. Min-jae approached. He crouched down. He looked at the bag. It wasn't bread inside. Inside were counting sticks, wooden ones, worn, old. The girl hadn't stolen any bread. She'd taken the discarded counting sticks from a trash pile, and the boys had decided they were loot. Min-jae asked why she needed the sticks. The girl answered quietly. She said she liked to count, that her father had taught her to count before they took him away. Min-jae asked who her father was. The girl answered, Kim Tae-hyun, a merchant from the province of Haseon, executed 3 months ago for smuggling. Min-jae froze. The daughter of an executed merchant, an orphan, out on the street, with counting sticks in her hands. He asked her name. She replied, May. Kim May. So-yeon Jeon, an apothecary, joined the shop as a partner in the medicinal product line. She created the first 3 products, which immediately found a market. Min-jae continued to expand the product lines. At the end of the chapter, Kim May ran into the shop. An orphaned girl, the daughter of an executed merchant, with a talent for arithmetic. Min-Jae led May to the back room. Yuna poured her some porridge. The girl ate eagerly with both hands. Then she looked up and asked if he would turn her away. Min-jae replied that he wouldn't. So-yeon stood in the doorway and watched May. Then, without a word, she took a clean cloth out of her bag and held it out to the girl to wipe her face. May took it. Her hands were shaking. Min-jae sat down beside her and began to talk. Not to interrogate her, just to talk. Slowly, calmly. May told her story. Her father was 42 years old. He traded in fabrics between two provinces. When the decree on the unified table was issued, his caravan was confiscated at the border post. He was arrested, accused of smuggling. The trial lasted 1 day. The sentence was death. May was left alone. Her house was confiscated. Her father's debts fell on her. Debt collectors sold her at the slave market in a neighboring town. She escaped from there 3 days later. She walked all the way to Yonhee, 2 weeks on the road. She ate whatever she could find. She slept under bridges. Min-jae listened in silence. When May finished, he asked only one thing. What is 347 multiplied by 12? May blinked. Then she answered without hesitation. 4,164. Min-jae checked the calculation in his head. It was correct. He asked another question. 1,200 divided by 17. May thought for 3 seconds. She answered, 70 and 10/17. Min-jae leaned back and looked at the ceiling. In his past life, the analytics department was staffed by people with 2 advanced degrees who couldn't calculate that quickly in their heads. But this 10-year-old girl with a split lip did it with ease. He turned to Yuna and said they'd just started a finance department. Yuna looked at May. May looked at both of them. Min-jae told her she could stay, not as an orphan taken in out of pity, but as an apprentice, with pay, with food, with a roof over her head, with a job she'd enjoy. May was silent. Then her chin began to tremble. She pressed her lips together. She turned away toward the wall, and Min-jae saw her small shoulders shake. She was crying silently. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to comfort her. He just sat beside her and waited. Yuna brought a blanket and covered the girl. So-young placed a mug of warm tea for insomnia next to her. Choi fell asleep 10 minutes later. Min-jae left the room and closed the door. Mana of the stream, 36. He hadn't sold anything. He hadn't made an exchange. But his mana had grown. He stood in the dimly lit shop, trying to understand. Then he understood. Justice. Not an exchange of goods. Justice for its own sake. He had given the girl, whom the world had cast out onto the streets, a place where she could be human. And the world had responded. The 28th day. Min-jae was preparing for 2 things at once. For Inspector Hwang Moon's visit in 2 days, and for the payment to Bae Sun in 2 weeks. He had 16 gold pieces. He needed 22. 6 gold pieces in 2 weeks. Doable. Tang Gu-ho brought oil and took back salt and cinnamon for Namhae village. Return cargo. 2-way logistics. Every cart makes a round trip. Min-jae taught May how to keep the ledger. He showed her the columns. Date, goods, quantity, price, buyer, source. May listened with such eagerness, as if he were giving her air to breathe. She grasped everything instantly. An hour later, she was already recording transactions in neat, small handwriting. 2 hours later, she found a mistake in his own calculations. Min-jae looked. Indeed, he had recorded 20 measures of oil at 3 silver coins each as 6 gold coins. But the exchange rate was 10 silver coins to 1 gold coin, not 10 to 6. The correct amount was exactly 6. There was no mistake. Min-jae snorted. May said no. She explained that he had recorded the source of the oil as Namhae, at 1 silver coin per measure. 20 measures meant 20 silver coins. 2 gold coins in expenses. 6 minus 2 is 4 in profit. But he had recorded 6 as profit. Min-jae stared at the ledger, then at May. She looked at him calmly. He had forgotten to subtract the cost of goods sold from the entry. A senior category manager, with a degree in logistics, a 10-year-old girl had found his mistake after just 2 hours of work. Min-jae corrected the entry, and he thought that this was exactly the kind of person he'd been missing. The 29th day, the eve of the inspection, Min-jae spent the evening checking every line in the ledger. May sat next to him and checked along with him. Yuna was cooking porridge. So-yeon was packing an order for the pharmacist. Han Sun-yi was mopping the floors. The shop looked clean. The shelves were neat. The merchandise was neatly arranged. Price tags were on every item. Min-jae had written the prices on small wooden tags. This seemed strange in this world. No shop in Yonhee displayed price tags. The customer would ask. The seller would name a price. They would haggle. Min-jae had done away with haggling. There was one price, for everyone, always. It was unusual. Some customers took offense. They said haggling was a tradition, that without haggling, there was no respect. Min-jae explained. A fixed price meant that a poor widow paid the same as a wealthy merchant, that no one overpaid because they didn't know how to haggle, that this, in fact, was respect. Not everyone agreed, but everyone came back, because the price was fair and the merchandise was good. The 30th day, morning. Inspector Hwang Moon-ju walked into the shop at exactly 9 o'clock. Min-jae recognized him immediately, even though he'd never seen him before. Tall, lean, about 45 years old, a silver brooch in the shape of a set of scales on the collar of his dark cloak. His face wasn't mean. It was tired. His eyes were intelligent and attentive. He was accompanied by 2 assistants carrying writing supplies. Hwang Moon-ju stopped at the threshold and surveyed the shop. The shelves, the merchandise, price tags, the counter, May behind the counter with her ledger, Yu-nu by the stove, So-yeon at the oak table with jars and vials. He looked at it all and raised an eyebrow slightly. Then he said he wanted to see the business license, the ledgers, documents for all purchases, certificates of origin for the goods, and the license from the Great Spice Guild. Min-jae placed the ledger in front of him. The business license, receipts from suppliers, every single one of them. Hwang Moon-ju sat down at the table and began to read. His assistants stood behind him taking notes. The inspector read slowly and carefully, turning each page and running his finger down the columns. Sometimes he went back and checked the figures. Min-jae stood nearby and remained silent. He didn't fidget. He didn't offer explanations. He waited for questions. Hwang Moon-ju reached the entry about oil from Namhae. He looked up. He asked if there was a license for interregional trade. Min-jae replied that Namhae was in the same province as Yonhee. No interregional license was required. Hwang Moon-ju looked at him for a long time. Then he returned to the book. An hour later he was finished. He closed the book. He stood up. His assistants remained silent. Hwang Moon-ju said he had found no violations, that the records were better kept than in most guild shops he had inspected over the past 20 years, that a guild license was recommended but not required for trade within a single province. Then he paused, and added that he would remember this name, Lee Min-jae, and that he would return. He turned and left. Min-jae stood in the shop, catching his breath. Yuna approached from behind and placed her hand on his shoulder, gently, for just a second. Then she took it away. Min-jae turned around. Yuna was already standing by the stove, stirring the porridge. He looked at May. May was sitting behind the counter, clutching the ledger to her chest. Her eyes were wide open. She, too, had been holding her breath the whole time. Min-jae winked at her. May exhaled, and for the first time in days, she smiled. Min-jae took May on as an apprentice, and she immediately showed a talent for arithmetic and bookkeeping. Inspector Hwang Moon-ju conducted an audit and found no violations. He acknowledged the quality of the bookkeeping, but warned that he would remember Min-jae's name. Their first serious clash with the guild authorities was behind them. The team was growing and becoming stronger. 1 month and 1 week after waking up, Min-jae stood in the doorway of the shop and looked out onto the street. Chestnut Street was changing, slowly but surely. The neighboring house, which had stood with its windows boarded up, was now open. The old potter, whose debt Min-jae had settled through barter, had once again put his wares out on the counter. Across the street, the woman who sold fabrics had swept the courtyard and hung up a new sign. Not because Min-jae had asked her to, but because people were walking the streets again. People were heading to the cafe. They were passing by on their way to other shops. They were buying things. They were talking. Chestnut Street had a pulse again. Min-jae closed his eyes and sensed the path of demand. It had become clearer over the past few weeks. Before, he could only sense nearby points, Yeonhee and the surrounding area. Now the radius had expanded. He sensed the city to the east where there was a shortage of cloth, a village to the west where there was a surplus of wool, a port 2 days' journey to the south where rice was rotting because the middleman hadn't arrived. The map inside his head was becoming more detailed, and every point on it was an opportunity. He paid off his debt to Bae Sun on the 40th day, 2 days ahead of schedule, 22 gold pieces. He placed it on the moneylender's table and watched as the man counted it. Bae Sun counted it 3 times. Then he nodded. Then he said something unexpected. He asked if Min-jae wanted to invest the money. Bae Sun had a debtor in the eastern province, the owner of a wool workshop. The debt was 5 gold pieces. The workshop was worth 2010. If Min-jae bought out the debt for 4 gold pieces, he'd gain leverage over the workshop. Or he could strike a deal with the debtor and secure a wool supplier. Min-jae listened. Bae Sun was offering him a tool. Leverage through debt. Buy someone else's debt. Apply pressure. Acquire an asset. A classic hostile takeover scheme. In his past life, he'd seen how this worked. Effective, ruthless, and completely incompatible with his ability. If he gained control of the workshop through coercion, the flow of coins would interpret it as compulsion, and it would reset his mana to 0. 7 days without his ability, without the pocket storehouse, without the path of demand. He'd be blind and naked in the middle of enemy territory. Min-jae refused. He said he preferred trade to debt. Bae Sung looked at him, shrugged, said that in that case, he'd sell the debt to someone less particular. Min-jae left the loan shark's place and stopped on the street. A wool workshop in the eastern province. The path of demand responded immediately. The workshop is operational. There's wool. The craftsman is skilled. But the debt hangs like a noose. If Bae Sung sells the debt to someone ruthless, the workshop will be ruined. Min-jae thought it over. Then he turned around and walked back. He went to Bae Sun and said he'd buy the debt. 4 gold pieces. Bae Sun smiled. Min-jae paid. 4 gold pieces, more than 1/3 of what he'd earned in a month. But he wasn't going to put pressure on the workshop. He was going to offer the master a deal, writing off the debt in exchange for a contract to supply wool at a fixed price for a year. A fair price, not below market value. Market value. The master gets rid of his debt. Min-jae gets a supplier. Everyone's happy. Mana of the stream, 42. He wrote a letter to the master. He gave it to Tang Gu-ho to deliver on his way back from Namhae. Tang Gu-ho had already been traveling beyond just the south. His route had expanded. South for oil, east to the garrison, north for honey. The young man worked without complaint. He ate at the local shop. He slept in the hayloft by the stables. Min-jae raised his pay to 2 silver coins per trip. Tang Gu-ho said that was more than he earned in a week in Namhae. Min-jae replied that a good logistics specialist commands a high price. Tang Gu-ho didn't understand the word logistics specialist, but he smiled. On the evening of the 45th day, Min-jae sat in the shop and tallied up the month's earnings. Mei sat next to him and checked his numbers. She did this every evening, silently, intently. Sometimes she corrected him, and each time he felt a twinge of professional pride mixed with admiration. The results were as follows. Monthly income, 47 gold pieces. Expenses, 39. Of that, 22 went toward Bae Sun's debt. 4 went toward paying off the workshop's debt. The rest was operating expenses. Net profit, 8 gold pieces, plus 4 gold pieces in inventory, plus a contract with the garrison, plus a contract with the apothecary, plus a growing stream of customers at the cafe. Min-jae wrote down the final figure and circled it. Then he looked at May. She was staring at the number. Then she looked up and said that her father had earned 15 gold pieces in his best month, and he had been in business for 20 years. Min-jae replied that her father had worked under normal conditions, but he was working during a crisis, and a crisis is the best time for those who can see what people need. May asked how he knew that. Min-jae paused. Then he said that a very smart person had taught him, a long time ago, somewhere else. May didn't ask any further. She was used to Min-jae sometimes saying strange things about units of economics, cross-docking, and the sales funnel. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Money is a flow. Goods are a bridge. People are the channel. If the channel is clear, the flow moves on its own. On the 46th day, a reply arrived from the master in the eastern province. Tang Gu-ho brought it back on his return trip. The letter was short. The master wrote that he didn't believe it, that no one had ever offered to write off his debt in exchange for an honest contract, that he thought it was a trap. But if Lee Min-jae came in person, looked him in the eye, and said the same thing, then he would agree. Min-jae read the letter and nodded. He understood. This world had taught people to be deceitful, to fall into debt traps, to read the subtle signs that say one thing but mean another. Trust here died faster than it was formed, and to regain it, one had to look into someone's eyes. He set out on his journey the next day. Yoon-yi left the shop. May left the books. So-yeon left the apothecary's orders. Han Sun-yi left the kitchen. Tang Gu-ho drove him eastward, in a cart, with a load of oil for the garrison and a sack of cinnamon for the master as a gift. They set out at dawn. Min-jae sat in the cart and looked at the road, the hills, fields, distant mountains with white peaks. The world was beautiful, cruel and beautiful. After 5 hours' journey, they arrived at the eastern outpost. The soldiers checked the permit and the duty. They let them through. The quartermaster came out in person. He took the oil. He paid. He asked when the fish would arrive. Min-jae replied that it would be next week. They drove on. Beyond the outpost, the road grew worse. Rocks, potholes. The cart jolted. Tang Gu-ho guided the horse in silence. Min-jae was deep in thought. He was on his way to the woolmaster. This was his first deal outside of Yonghe, his first step beyond the city limits, the beginning of a network. If the master agreed, this would be the 5th trading post. Oil in the south, honey in the north, the garrison in the east, the shop in the center, and the wool workshop in the eastern province. 5 points on the map, connected by one man, by one idea. Fair trade instead of a monopoly. The cart creaked, the horse snorted. Min-jae closed his eyes and listened to the path of demand. It pulsed steadily. Ahead, the workshop. Wool. A man who's afraid to trust. Min-jae opened his eyes and sat up straight. He knew what to do. He always knew what to do when it came to convincing someone that a deal was fair. You just have to be honest. It's the most difficult strategy in the world, and the only one that works indefinitely. Min-jae paid off Bae-sun's debt and bought out the wool workshop's debt so he could offer the master an honest deal instead of pressure. He tallied the results of the first month. 8 gold pieces in net profit. The shop is growing. May keeps the books. The team works like a well-oiled machine. Min-jae set off for the eastern province to meet with the woolmaster for face-to-face negotiations. Expansion beyond Yonghe is beginning. Min-jae spotted the workshop from a distance. A long wooden building with a sagging roof on the outskirts of the small town of Tongwon. Smoke rising from the chimney. The smell of wet wool and dyes. Tang Gu-ho stopped the cart at the gate. Min-jae jumped down and knocked. A man in his 50s opened the door. He was sturdy. His hands were large and cracked from working with dyes. His eyes were wary. He looked at Min-jae and asked who he was. Min-jae introduced himself. The master took a step back. Then he told him to come in. Inside the workshop, It was warm and cramped. Looms stood in a row, 4 of them. 2 were in operation. Women sat behind them, thin and silent. Skewers of dyed wool hung on the walls, red, blue, and yellow. Min-jae stopped and looked. The wool was good, thick, evenly dyed. The master knew his craft. His name was Park Dong-ho. He led Min-jae into the back room. It was small, with just 1 table and 2 chairs. Papers lay on the table. I owe us, letters from creditors, a list of orders he couldn't fulfill because he couldn't ship the goods through the checkpoint. Min-jae sat down and placed the IOU in front of him. That very one. 5 gold pieces. Park Dong-ho looked at it, then at Min-jae. Min-jae said he would tear up the IOU right then and there. In exchange, he asked for one thing: a contract to supply wool, 20 skeins a month, at market price, no less, exactly what the master would sell to any buyer. Park Dong-ho remained silent. Min-jae could tell he didn't believe him. He could see it in the way the master clenched his hands under the table, in the way he looked not into his eyes, but at the receipt. Min-jae took the receipt, tore it in half, placed both halves in front of the master. Park Dong-ho stared at the torn paper. Then he raised his eyes. They were wet. He asked why. Min-jae answered simply. He said he needed wool, not slaves, that a master who works under duress produces poor quality wool. But a master who works of his own free will produces the best wool in the province, and that Min-jae wanted the best. Park Dong-ho stood up. He walked out of the room. Min-jae could hear him standing behind the door, breathing heavily. A minute later he returned. He sat down. He said he agreed. 20 skeins a month, at market price. And he added that he would give the first 5 skeins for free, as a token of gratitude. Min-jae wanted to refuse, but he looked at the master and realized that a refusal would be an insult. For the first time in a long while, this man was able to give something of his own free will. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Min-jae accepted. The mana of the stream flared so brightly that he was blinded for a second. 49. They spent 2 days in Tongwon. Min-jae inspected the workshop. He found 3 problems that could be solved within a week. The looms were positioned incorrectly. The light was coming from the wrong direction. The workers were wasting time carrying skeins across the entire room because the storage area was against the far wall and the looms were against the near wall. He suggested rearranging them. Park Dong-ho listened with his mouth agape. Then he asked how a young spice merchant knew how a weaving workshop was set up. Min-jae replied that he didn't know, but he knew how the workflow was organized, and that the workflow was the same everywhere. Input, processing, output. The shorter the path between them, the faster the result. In 2 days, they rearranged the looms. They moved the storage area. They cut a new window in the wall to let in light. The female workers looked at Min-jae as if he were an eccentric. Then they tried working in the new layout. And on the very first day, they produced 3 more skeins than usual. Park Dong-ho stood in the middle of the workshop, shaking his head. On the way back, Tang Gu-ho was carrying 5 skeins of wool. Min-jae sat beside him, lost in thought. Wool in Yonhee cost twice as much as in Tongwon. That was because it wasn't transported through the checkpoint. 5 skeins were worth 10 gold pieces at the Yonhee market, for free. He could sell them and pocket the money. Or he could do something else. Min-jae asked Tang Gu-ho to stop at the eastern checkpoint. He went to see the quartermaster. He offered the wool for soldiers' blankets. Winter was approaching. The garrison needed warm clothing. The quartermaster looked at the wool. He felt it. He sniffed it, and ordered 50 skeins. 50. 5 times Park Dong-ho's monthly quota. Min-jae didn't bat an eye. He said he'd deliver in 6 weeks. The quartermaster asked if it could be sooner. Min-jae replied that quality takes time. The quartermaster nodded and issued an advance payment. 10 gold pieces. Min-jae held the money in his hands and counted it in his head. 10 gold pieces as an advance. He needed to buy 50 skeins from Park Dong-ho. At the market price in Tongwon, that's 2 silver pieces per skein. 100 silver pieces. 10 gold pieces. The advance would cover the purchase exactly. The profit would come from the sales to the quartermaster. The quartermaster would pay 4 silver coins per skein, 200 silver coins, minus 100 for the purchase, minus transportation costs. A net profit of about 8 gold pieces for a single order. But for that to happen, Park Dong-ho had to work faster, twice as fast. He needed more people and more looms. Min-jae wrote him a letter. The letter wasn't a request, it was a plan. How many people to hire, what additional looms to buy, where to get cheap raw wool from shepherds in the mountains. Min-jae enclosed 5 gold pieces from his advance in the letter. For expansion, Tang Gu-ho took the letter to Tongwon the next day. Min-jae stood at the gate of Yonhee and watched the cart drive away. Yuna was standing nearby. She had come to meet him when she saw the cart on the road. She didn't say anything. She just stood there beside him. Min-jae turned to her and said they needed a second location. Not a cafe, a shop, a real store. At the inn by the eastern outpost, soldiers, cart drivers, and the occasional traveler pass through there. They'll need spices, oil, wool, and medicine. Yuna listened. Then she asked who would run it. Min-jae replied that she would. Yuna paused. She looked at him. She said she couldn't leave the shop in Yonhee. Min-jae replied that Han Sung-yi would take over the shop in Yonhee. She'll manage. So-yeon will help. Mei will keep an eye on the numbers. And Yuna is needed where things are more challenging. Because she's the only one he trusts to open a new location. Yuna was silent for a long time. Then she said she needed to think it over, and that her daughter needed a school, not an inn. Min-jae replied that at the second location, he would set up a class for the children. 3 hours in the morning. Mei would teach them how to count. So-yeon would teach them about herbs, and Yuna would decide for herself what else to teach. Yuna looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time. Then she quietly said that he was an impossible person. And she went to the shop to cook porridge. Mana Patoka, 53. Min-jae met personally with Master Park Dong-ho and wrote off the debt in exchange for a fair contract. He helped reorganize the workshop. He received a large order from the garrison for 50 skeins of wool. He invested the advance into expanding production. He suggested to Yuna that she open a second retail location at the inn near the eastern outpost. Expansion beyond Yonhee is beginning. It's been 3 months since I woke up. The second shop at the inn near the eastern outpost opened 10 days after my conversation with Yuna. Yuna agreed. She picked up her daughter and moved her belongings. She settled into 2 rooms above the shop, which the innkeeper rented out for 1 silver coin a month. Min-jae came to help. He brought the merchandise from the pocket warehouse. He set up the shelves. He wrote out the price tags. He hung up the sign. Lee Min-jae's shop. Fair prices. Yuna stood in the center of the empty room and looked around. Min-jae could see that she was afraid, not of failure, but of the responsibility. For 2 years, she had been a widow simply waiting for life to end. And now she was the manager of a shop with inventory worth 15 gold pieces. Min-jae walked over and said he believed in her more than he did in his own calculations. Yuna replied that his calculations had never been wrong. Min-jae chuckled and said they had been wrong. It was just that Mei had corrected them before anyone noticed. Yuna almost smiled. The first week at the second shop brought in 3 gold pieces. As soldiers from the garrison would come by after their shifts, they bought oil, spices, and ointments from So-yeon. Cart drivers passing by the outpost would stop for the night and buy food and tea. Travelers would take little bags of cinnamon and pepper with them on their journeys. Yuna kept the books just as Min-jae had taught her, neatly, in 2 columns. Mei came once a week with Tang Gu-ho to check the books. The 10-year-old girl earnestly flipped through the pages and made notes in the margins. The soldiers looked at her in surprise. Yuna looked on with pride. On the 80th day, Min-jae received news that changed everything. Tang Gu-ho returned from Tongwon with a letter from Park Dong-ho. The master wrote that the expansion was underway. 2 new looms, 4 new female workers. Production had increased to 40 skeins a month, but he couldn't expand any further without raw materials. The shepherds in the mountains refused to sell their wool because the previous middleman had cheated them, and now they didn't trust anyone. Min-jae read the letter and understood. It's the same thing every time. Broken trust. A deception that poisons the supply chain for years to come. One swindler cheated the shepherds, and now an entire workshop can't get raw materials. This wasn't a trade issue. It was a systemic problem, and he knew the cure, firsthand. He set out for the mountains. So-yeon asked to go with him. She said that herbs grow in the mountains that you can't find in the valley, and that she was tired of being cooped up inside. Min-jae agreed. They set out at dawn, without a cart, on foot, over the mountain pass. The journey into the mountains took 2 days. So-yeon walked quickly and didn't complain. Min-jae noticed that she was gathering herbs as they went. She would stop, cut them, wrap them in cloth, and jot them down in her notebook. That evening, by the campfire, they talked for the first time about, for real. Not about merchandise, not about recipes. So-yeon told him that her father had been the best doctor in the eastern province, that he'd been teaching her since she was 5, that she knew more than any licensed pharmacist. But they wouldn't give her a license, because she was a woman, because of the law, because the great guild of physicians had not accepted women ever since, 3 generations ago, a female pharmacist had cured a marquis whom the guild's physicians had been unable to save. The guild was humiliated. The law was passed. Women were banned. So-yeon spoke of this without anger, with weariness. Min-jae listened and thought that in his world, women had gained the right to a medical license less than 100 years ago, and that progress is when injustice becomes obvious to everyone, not just to those who suffer from it. He told So-yeon that when his network became large enough, he would open a school for female pharmacists, for women who had been denied licenses. He couldn't change the guild's law, but he could create a space where the law didn't matter, because people would come for help, not for a piece of paper. So-yeon looked at him through the fire. Her eyes were shining. She said he was either a dreamer or a madman. Min-jae replied that he'd already heard that from Yuna, and that both options suited him just fine. So-yeon laughed, sharply, briefly. Then she turned away. On the 3rd day, they reached a shepherd settlement in the mountains. 10 yurts on a rocky plateau. Sheep, goats, the smell of manure and smoke. The elder met them at the entrance. An old man with a sun-scorched face. Min-jae didn't mention the wool. He didn't propose a deal. He took a small bag of salt out of his pocket storage, a jar of honey, 3 small bags of medicinal tea from So-yeon, and he said he'd brought gifts. The elder accepted them warily, but he invited them to sit by the fire. They ate together, salty goat's milk and flatbreads made from coarse flour. Min-jae ate everything and expressed his gratitude. So-yeon examined the 3 sick children in the settlement. One had a fever. The second had a rash on his arms. The third had a cough that hadn't gone away for a month. So-yeon took out her supplies and treated them until nightfall. The elder watched. In the morning, he approached Min-jae himself and asked what he needed. Min-jae said, "Wool, 10 skeins of raw wool a month." At a fair price. He named a figure. The elder thought for a moment. He said that the previous merchant had paid half as much and then stopped coming. Min-jae replied that he wasn't the previous merchant, and that So-yeon would come once a month to examine the children, for free. The elder looked at So-yeon. So-yeon nodded. The elder held out his hand. Min-jae shook it. Stream mana, 61. The return trip took a day and a half. So-yeon was silent for most of the way. Then, during a rest stop, she said she'd realized something. That Min-jae didn't trade in goods. He traded in trust. The goods are just an excuse. Trust is the product. Min-jae looked at her. She was sitting on a rock, holding her notebook. The wind ruffled her hair. Her eyes were serious and warm. He said that in his world, it's called social capital. So-yeon snorted and said it sounded like heresy. Min-jae replied that every good idea sounds like heresy at first. They returned to Yonhee at sunset. Yuna was standing at the gate of the second location, waiting. She saw them. She saw Min-jae and So-yeon walking side by side, a little closer than colleagues, a little farther apart than friends. Her face froze for a second, Then she smiled and said the porridge was getting cold. Min-jae opened the second outpost at the eastern outpost under Yuna's management. He went into the mountains with So-yeon to set up a supply of raw wool from the shepherds. So-yeon treated the shepherds' children, and that became the key to the deal. The wool supply chain was complete. Shepherds, workshop, shop, garrison. So-yeon and Min-jae began to grow closer. Yuna noticed this dot. The 6th month, the Silent Guild. Min-jae had never spoken those words aloud. Others had coined the term. The carters who transported his goods, the shopkeepers who bought from him and resold the goods, the artisans who received orders through his network. Someone named it that one evening at Yeonhee's tavern, and the name stuck. The Quiet Guild. Because it operated quietly. No signs, no coats of arms, no licenses. 7 locations across 3 provinces. Not shops in the usual sense. Kitchens at inns, nooks at the docks, back rooms next to workshops, places where you could buy things you couldn't find anywhere else. Oil, wool, lemon jam, medicinal teas, mountain honey, dried fish, pepper and cinnamon. Each location operated under a local manager. Min-jae didn't take a cut of the profits. He took a share of the goods. Each manager bought from him at cost and sold at the local market price. The difference was theirs to keep. Min-jae made his money on turnover, not on the margin. The more outlets, the higher the turnover. The higher the turnover, the cheaper the purchase price. The cheaper the purchase price, the lower the price for the customer. The lower the price, the more customers. A flywheel. A self-accelerating flywheel. In a past life, this was called the Costco model. Minimal margin, maximum volume. Loyalty through value, not through discounts. Mana of the flow. 89. The pocket warehouse had grown to the size of a barn. The path of demand showed 7 out of 12 provinces. But there was one more skill he hadn't activated yet. Hidden caravan. Cost, 90 mana units. One honest deal before the grand opening. Min-jae waited. He wasn't in a hurry. The right deal would come on its own. It came in the form of a girl, tall, with a light brown braid, wearing a leather jacket and carrying an axe at her belt. She walked into the shop in Yeonhee at noon and sat down at the counter. She asked if they needed security for caravans. May called Min-jae from the back room. He came out and saw the northern woman. She introduced herself as Nasta, commander of a 5-man security squad, former mercenaries, looking for an honest employer. Min-jae asked what she meant by honest. Nasta answered bluntly. Their last employer hadn't paid them for 3 months. Then he ordered them to kill a witness on the road. They refused. He set the guards on them. They left. Now they were wanted in 2 provinces as deserters. Min-jae listened. The path of inquiry remained silent. This wasn't a commercial inquiry. It was a human one. 5 people with nowhere to go, who were tired of killing for money, who needed someone they wouldn't be ashamed to work for. Min-jae offered terms. Full payment up front, 2 gold pieces per person per month. Food at his expense. No violence except in self-defense. Their job was to protect goods and people. No attacks. Nasta looked at him. Then she asked who pays up front for the mercenaries the guard is looking for. Min-jae replied that he pays people, not reputations. Nasta was silent for 5 seconds. Then she held out her hand. Min-jae shook it. Mana of the stream. 90. The hidden caravan. Skill activated. He felt it as an expansion, as if the world around him had become thinner, more transparent. He could now take a cart loaded with cargo and envelop it in something invisible. Not for those nearby, for those at the checkpoints, for those searching for contraband from above and below. The wagon rolled down the road, and no one could see what was on it. As if it were air, as if there were nothing there. The first hidden caravan left Yeonhee 3 days later. Tan Gu-ho was in the wagon. Nasta and 2 of her men were on horseback. 20 skeins of wool for a trading post in the western province. 10 measures of oil for the northern one. 40 small bags of spices. 10 jars of medicinal ointment. They passed through 2 checkpoints. The soldiers saw the empty cart and the three horsemen. They checked their documents. They let them through. Tang Gu-ho shook his head in disbelief from the cart. Nasta rode in silence. She didn't ask any questions. That was one of the qualities Min Jae valued most. In the 7th month, what he had feared happened. Inspector Hwang Moon-ju returned, but not to the shop. He showed up at the inn near the eastern outpost. Yuna had sent a note via a messenger. Min Jae arrived the next day. Hwang Moon-ju was sitting in the room above the shop drinking tea. Yuna was standing against the wall, calm on the outside, pale. Min Jae entered. He sat down across from the inspector. Hwang Moon-ju took a sip of tea and began to speak. He said that over the past 3 months, the volume of trade in Yonhee and the surrounding area had grown by 40%. That this was an anomaly. That no other city in the empire was showing such growth. That the Great Spice Guild had tasked him with finding out why. And that he had found out. The Silent Guild. A network of small, unlicensed outlets. Caravans passing through checkpoints unseen. Suppliers operating without guild contracts. Min Jae listened. He didn't interrupt. Hwang Moon-ju set down his cup and said he had the authority to shut down all 7 outlets, arrest Min Jae, confiscate the goods, and refer the case to the capital's court. Min Jae remained silent. Then he asked one question. He asked how many people the Silent Guild fed. Hwang Moon-ju didn't answer. Min Jae answered for him. 312 people. Workers and their families. Fishermen and shepherds and weavers and apothecaries and porters and cooks and cart drivers. 312 people who, 6 months ago, couldn't afford to buy salt. But now they buy oil and wool and honey and medicine. They pay taxes. They send their children to school. They eat hot porridge every evening. Hwang Moon-ju listened. His expression didn't change. Then he took a thick notebook out of his bag. He opened it to the last page. There were numbers there, his own calculations. And Min Jae saw that the inspector wasn't counting violations. He was calculating the economy, trade volume, employment growth, falling prices for basic goods, increased tax revenue for the local treasury. Hwang Moon-ju closed the notebook and said that his numbers didn't add up. That according to all the great guilds' models, free trade should lead to chaos and dumping. But here, it was leading to growth. He didn't understand why. Min Jae looked at him and didn't see an enemy. He saw an honest man who had been confronted with facts that contradicted his beliefs. Min Jae offered him a deal. Not a bribe, not a threat, a deal. Hwang Moon-ju won't shut down the Silent Guild. In return, Min Jae would open all his books to him. Every figure, every transaction, every route. Let the inspector check for himself. Let him see from the inside how it all works, and if, in a month, his numbers still didn't add up, then Min Jae himself would come to the capital and turn himself in. Hwang Moon-ju thought. For a long time. Then he nodded. The Silent Guild had expanded to 7 locations across 3 provinces. Nasta and her squad had joined as security. The hidden caravan skill was activated. Inspector Hwang Moon-ju returned with a threat to shut down the operation. Min Jae offered to open all the books to him. A month of surveillance began. The conflict with the guild had reached a new level. The month of surveillance changed Hwang Moon-ju. He traveled the routes with Tang Gu-ho. He sat in the shops and kept track of the numbers. He talked with customers. He watched Yuna manage the outpost. He watched Mei check the ledgers. He watched So-yun prepare ointments and tes. He watched Nasta and her people guard the caravans without raising their weapons. He saw how an old beekeeper from a mountain village brought honey and smiled because, for the first time in 3 years, he had a regular customer. He saw how fishermen in Namhae were finishing construction on a new pier with the money they earned from selling oil. How the women workers at Park Dong-ho's workshop buy their children winter clothes made of wool they wove themselves. And on the 27th day of his observation, Hwang Moon-ju sat down across from Min Jae in a shop in Yonhee and said that his numbers added up. That free trade between small businesses creates more value than the monopoly of the great guilds. That Min Jae's model doesn't destroy the existing order but creates a new one one that's more sustainable and more just. And that, armed with this knowledge, he couldn't return to the guild and pretend he hadn't seen it. Min-jae asked what he planned to do. Hwang Moon-ju replied that he wanted to stay, not as an inspector, but as an advisor. For 20 years, he had viewed the economy of monopolies. Now he wants to study the economy of freedom. Min-jae held out his hand to him. Stream mana, 107, and along with the mana, something else. A skill, a new one. Seal of the deal. It activated on its own, without him choosing it. No menu. It simply turned on when Hwang Moon-ju shook his hand. Min-jae felt something warm flare up between their palms, and he understood. Any agreement sealed by his handshake was now physically impossible to break. Not by law, not a threat. The world itself would not allow it. But there was a downside. The seal worked both ways. If he broke a promise made with a handshake, the consequences would fall on him, not on the other party. Absolute responsibility, absolute honesty. By the 9th month, the Silent Guild had 15 locations across 5 provinces. Hwang Moon-ju overhauled the accounting system. Mei rose to become the chief auditor. So-yeon launched a line of baby food that became a hit in 3 provinces. Yuna managed 3 locations simultaneously. Han Sun-yi ran the kitchen in Yeonhee and trained new chefs. Tang Gu-ho supervised 4 cart drivers. Nasta guarded the caravans on 3 routes. And one evening, an unfamiliar woman walked into the shop. Tall, young, dressed like a simple servant, but with a poise that couldn't be hidden behind coarse fabric. She asked for a job. Any job. She said she could read, write, and speak 3 languages. Min-jae looked at her. The path of inquiry remained silent, but his own intuition spoke loudly. This girl was no maid. He asked her name. She said, Ha-eun. Min-jae asked for her last name. She hesitated. Then she said, So. Ha-eun So. The daughter of Marquis So-young-ho. The one who had been executed 4 months ago for smuggling. The very same Marquis who had tried to fight the monopoly of the great guilds and lost. Min-jae understood everything instantly. She hadn't come for work. She had come to find out who this merchant from Yeonhee was, the one doing what her father couldn't. Perhaps to destroy him, perhaps to help him. He offered her tea. She took the cup, and he saw her fingers trembling. Not from the cold, from rage, or from hope. Min-jae said he knew who she was. Ha-eun turned pale. Min-jae said her father had been right, that a monopoly kills trade, that the decree on the unified table was suffocating the country, and that if she wanted to carry on her father's work, not with a sword but with an abacus, then he needed a diplomat, someone who knew how to speak to officials in their own language. Ha-eun set down her cup. Her hands were no longer shaking. She asked what exactly he was proposing. Min-jae replied, negotiations with local officials, permits for new locations, legal protection for the chain, handling documents and licenses. Ha-eun said there was a bounty on her head in the capital. Min-jae replied that they weren't in the capital. For the first time during the entire conversation, Ha-eun allowed herself to exhale. In the 10th month, the Silent Guild had come to light, not to the great guilds, but to the emperor. Lee Min-jae's name was mentioned during the morning briefing in the throne room. Court Archmage Yeon-su mentioned an anomaly. In the provinces where the Silent Guild operates, the magical flow is growing stronger. The rains fall on schedule, harvests are bountiful. The streetlights in the cities shine brighter. This was impossible. According to the Archmage's model, the flow was supposed to be weakening everywhere. It had been weakening for 10 years already. The decree on the unified table was his idea, to restrict trade, to concentrate the flow, to preserve magic. But in 5 out of 12 provinces, the flow was growing, and in all 5, a single merchant from Yeonhee was operating. Archmage Yeon-su stood before the map and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Fear. Not for the world, for himself. Because if this merchant was right, and free trade strengthened the flow, then everything the Archmage had done was a mistake. That meant he had destroyed the world while trying to save it. That meant his theory was worthless. and that meant the emperor would find out. The Archmage closed the map. He summoned the commander of the Night Watch, and he ordered him to find Li Min-jae, dead or alive. Better dead. Min-jae didn't know any of this. He was standing in Yonhee Square, watching children run between the stalls. Yuna stood beside him. So-yeon was writing down a recipe. Mei was counting the day's takings. Ha-eun was talking to an official from the city council. Nasta was sitting on the steps, sharpening a knife. The city was alive. The city was breathing. And Min-jae could hear a warm hum beneath his ribs. Steady, calm, strong. The manna of the stream. 123. He didn't know that in 2 weeks they would come for him. Hwang Moon-ju had switched sides to Min-jae, becoming his advisor. The seal of the deal had been activated. Ha-eun-so, the daughter of the executed marquis, had joined as a network diplomat. The Silent Guild had grown to 15 outposts. Archmage Yeon-su discovered that the flow was growing stronger in Min-jae's provinces and sent the Night Watch. The main threat was approaching. They arrived at night. 12 riders of the Night Watch in black cloaks with silver embroidery. A captain named Kang Do-yun rode at the head of the group. Min-jae learned of their arrival 3 hours beforehand. The trail of demand was behaving strangely. It wasn't showing goods, it was showing people. 12 hungry, frozen people galloping along the winter road toward Yonhee. Their demand was simple: warmth, food, rest. They had been traveling from the capital itself for 6 days with almost no stops. Min-jae got out of bed. He got dressed. He woke Yuna and told her to make porridge. A large pot, enough for 12 people. Yuna asked who it was for. Min-jae replied that it was for guests. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she went to the stove. He woke up Nastya. He told her that in 3 hours, the Emperor's night guard would enter the city, that they should put away their weapons, that there would be no resistance. Nastya said he was crazy. Then she put away her weapons. Min-jae stepped out onto the shop's porch and sat down on the step. The night was cold. Winter in Yonhee smelled of coal and frozen earth. The stars hung low. He sat there and waited. So-yeon appeared beside him. She sat down on the step next to him, silently. 10 minutes later, Mei arrived. She wrapped herself in a blanket. She pressed herself against Min-jae's shoulder. Then Ha-eun. She stood behind them, upright, pale. Then Han Sun-yi. Then Hwang Moon-ju. They all knew. It was a small town. News travels faster than horses. By 3 o'clock in the morning, 12 horsemen rode into Yonhee Square. The horses were covered in foam. Their cloaks were caked in road mud. Captain Kang Do-yun dismounted and looked around. He saw a man on the steps of a shop, thin, calm, surrounded by people who stood motionless. The captain approached. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, and he said that, in the name of Emperor Renjun, Li Min-jae was accused of violating the decree on the unified table, of smuggling, of creating an illegal trade network, of undermining the imperial economy, and that he had been ordered to bring him to the capital, dead or alive. Min-jae stood up. He looked at the captain. He looked at his men. 12 soldiers, exhausted, hungry. One could barely stay in the saddle. Another had a bandage on his arm. They had ridden for 6 days in the winter cold, carrying out the orders of a man they had never seen. Min-jae asked if the captain had eaten today. Kang Do-yun blinked. The question didn't fit into the arrest protocol. Min-jae turned to Yuna and nodded. Yuna came out of the shop carrying a large pot of hot broth, thick, rich, with meat and vegetables. The aroma swept across the square like a wave. 12 soldiers turned their heads at once. Min-jae took a clay bowl out of his pocket storage. He poured the broth into it. He handed it to the captain and named the price. 1 copper coin. Kang Do-yun looked at the bowl, then at Min-jae, then at his men. They looked at the broth the way one looks at water in the desert. The captain slowly reached into his belt. He pulled out a copper coin. He placed it in Min-jae's palm. Between the coins clinked so loudly that Min-jae felt as if the whole city could hear it. The seal of the transaction flashed into being, invisible yet absolute. The ancient law of the flow, older than any decree, older than any throne. A person who trades honestly with another enters into a relationship of exchange with them. And as long as that relationship endures, neither of them can raise a hand against the other. Because the flow does not allow the destruction of its own course. The captain froze. He felt it. He didn't understand it, but he felt it. Something inside him prevented him from drawing his sword. Something warm and heavy, like a conscience. Min-jae began pouring out the broth, bowl after bowl. The soldiers dismounted one after another and took their portions. They paid a copper coin. They sat right on the stones of the square and ate, silently, hungrily. So-yeon brought out ointment for the wounded soldier. She treated his arm. She bandaged it with a clean cloth. The soldier looked at her and didn't know what to say. Ha-yoon brought blankets. May counted the bowls. Nasta stood in the shadows, motionless. Yuna ladled out the broth. An hour later, all 12 soldiers were sitting against the walls of the houses, wrapped in blankets with empty bowls in their hands. Captain Kang Do-yoon sat on the steps of a bench next to Min-jae, right where So-yeon had been sitting 3 hours earlier. He was silent for a long time. Then he said he couldn't arrest him. Not because he didn't want to, because he physically couldn't. Something was holding him back. Min-jae nodded. Then he said he needed the captain's help. Not protection. Help. He asked Kang Do-yoon to take not him, but a letter to the capital. A letter to Emperor Rangjun. In the letter, Min-jae wrote everything. About the Silent Guild. About the flow that grows from free trade rather than dying out. About Archmage Yeon-su, whose theory of compression is killing the world instead of saving it. About the 312 people who are living again. About the grandmother in the northern village who drinks southern tea. About the fisherman who buys northern salt. About the children learning to count in a shop on Chestnut Street. And at the end of the letter, a single line. He wrote that if the emperor wants to understand how to save the flow, he should come himself. Not with an army, not with the guild, alone. And Min-jae will pour him tea. Kang Do-yoon took the letter. That morning, 12 horsemen left Yeonhee, without the prisoner, with full bellies and clean bandages on their wounds. 2 months passed. Winter gave way to spring. The Silent Guild had grown to 30 branches across 8 provinces. Min-jae opened a school next to the shop in Yeonhee. May taught arithmetic. So-yeon taught herbal medicine. Ha-eun taught writing and rhetoric. 22 students. Children of widows, orphans, and former slaves. Yuna managed 5 branches and never made a single mistake in her reports. Hwang Moon-ju wrote a 120-page treatise on free trade and sent a copy to the Imperial Academy. Nasta escorted 3 caravans a week, and for the first time in 5 years, did not draw her weapon. Park Dong-ho hired 20 female workers, and his workshop became the best in the eastern province. The fishermen of Namhae built a second pier and named it Lee Pier. An old beekeeper in the mountains began teaching his grandson how to make honey. Mana of the stream. 241. And Min-jae felt that the world was responding. The rains came on time. The lanterns burned brightly. For the first time in 10 years, the mages' academies in the 3 cities had filled their classes to capacity. The stream was growing, not because it was being restrained, because it had been set free. On the first day of the second spring, an unassuming cart rolled into Yeonhee Square. No coat of arms, no guards, 1 coachman and 1 passenger in a traveling cloak. Min-jae was standing by his stall cleaning the counter. He saw the carriage and stopped. The path of demand flared up inside him as it had never flared up before. Not a demand for goods, a demand for the truth. Deep, desperate, lonely. The man in the cloak stepped out of the carriage. He removed his hood. A young face, 25 years old, tired eyes that bore the weight of an entire empire. Emperor Rangjun stood in Yeonhee Square and looked around. Children were running between the stalls. A woman was selling pastries by the fountain. An old man carried a basket of apples. Yuna was talking to a customer at the counter of the second stall. So-yeon sat on the steps with a notebook. May was counting coins on the porch. Nasta was sharpening a knife in the shade. Ha-un stood by the school and froze when she saw the emperor. She recognized him. Rei-jun approached Min-jae. The imperial guard stood somewhere in the distance. The silent guild was everywhere. The emperor held out a copper coin and quietly asked for a cup of tea. He said he wanted to know what it felt like, to pay a fair price. Min-jae took the coin. It settled into his palm, warm, light. A single copper coin. The rumbling in his chest grew deafening. It was the most valuable coin he had ever received. Not because the emperor had given it to him, but because the emperor had come in person. Without an army, without the guild, as a man. And he asked as a man. Min-jae bowed. He turned toward the shop. He went inside. Yuna was already standing by the stove. She had seen it. She understood everything. Without a word, she poured tea into the finest cup. She placed it on a tray. Next to it, she set a second cup, her own. So-yun followed her in. She placed a plate of almond cookies on the tray, a recipe she'd perfected over the past 6 months. Ha-un brought a clean napkin and spread it out on the table. Her hands didn't tremble. Mei counted out the change from a copper coin, seriously, precisely. She placed 2 small coins on the table. Nasta stood by the door, not with a weapon. She just stood there, because that was her place. Min-jae carried out the tray. He set it down in front of the emperor. Rei-jun sat down at the table in the square of a small town that didn't appear on any map in his throne room. He took a sip of tea. He said eyes. And Min-jae saw how, for a single second, the young emperor's face became that of an ordinary, weary, 25-year-old boy with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Ranjun opened his eyes. He looked at Min-jae and said he was ready to listen. They talked all night. Min-jae told him everything. About the stream, about how it grows through exchange rather than compression, about the archmage Yun-su who had been mistaken, about the 12 provinces that were suffocating, about how the world could be saved not by the sword, but by the scales. Renjun listened. He asked questions. He calculated along with him. Kwang Moonju brought his treatise. Mei brought the ledgers. Ha-un laid out the legal framework. So-yun demonstrated how healing tra disappear from provinces where the flow weakens. Yuna simply kept refilling the tea. By dawn, Emperor Renjun rose from the table. He looked out at the square, which was already waking up, at the shops opening for business, at the people heading to work. He turned to Min-jae and said that the decree on the unified table would be revoked, that the great guilds would lose their monopoly licenses, that Archmage Yun-su would be removed from office and brought to trial, and that he needed an advisor on trade. Min-jae shook his head. He said he didn't want titles. He didn't want a position. He didn't want a palace. He wanted to trade. That was all he knew how to do. That was all he needed. Rei-jun asked what he could offer in return. Min-jae replied, freedom. For all 12 provinces. For every grandmother and every fisherman and every boy with a cart. Open the roads, remove the checkpoints, let the flow run free, and the world will heal itself. The emperor looked at him. Then he nodded slowly. Then he held out his hand. Min-jae shook it. The seal of the deal flared between them, brighter than ever. And Min-jae felt something shift inside him. Not mana, not a skill, something more. The flow of the world. He could hear it. All of it. The 12 provinces, millions of people, every honest deal, every fair exchange, every bowl of porridge sold for a copper coin. He could hear the river flowing through all living things, and the river flowed freely. The emperor left in the morning, quietly, just as he had arrived. Min-jae stood in the square and watched as the carriage disappeared behind the hills. Yuna approached and stood beside him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. Not for a second. For a long time. So-yun stood on the other side. She gazed into the distance. Mei sat on the steps and wrote something in the ledger. Ha-yun stood by the school and cried. Quietly, out of relief, because her father's case was finally over. Nasta sat on the wall, swinging her legs. The sun was rising over Yonhee. The streetlights shone brighter than ever, not from oil, from the stream. Min-jae stood in the square of the small town that had saved the empire, not with a sword, not with magic, with scales and an honest word. Copper coins lay in his pockets. In his hands was Yuna's warm palm. On his counter stood a teapot with cold tea. On his counter lay an account book in which every line was the story of a person saved. He took a deep breath of the spring air. It smelled of wet earth and blossoming trees, of smoke from stoves, and of fresh bread from the bakery across the street. It smelled of life. He turned toward the shop. It was time to open up. The customers were waiting. The porridge wouldn't cook itself. Min-jae walked into the shop, wiped down the counter, hung a "open" sign on the door, and began a new day.